Thank you very much for those gracious and really excessive remarks, I have to say. Although the quote from Nietzsche is really apposite, and I hope to show you why in a few minutes. I have a slight cold and jet lagged, but as the great American sage Woody Allen said, 80% of success is just showing up. So I've already got a B, I think. I want to say what a truly great honor it is to have been asked by Rajiv and the leadership of the Center for the Study of Developing Societies to give the first of the several 50th year Golden Jubilee lectures, and also to have been asked by the leadership of the Philology group to have been asked to give the keynote address of their winter school. I'm terribly sorry I haven't been able to address any of their sessions because of my own schedule. The conjuncture between these two assignments, one from the center and another from the Philology group, will strike some of you as rather bizarre, but it's precisely this conjuncture between philology, which I view as a core humanistic discipline, the discipline of making sense of text, to use a very simple definition, and social cultural theory leading to social cultural transformation that has animated my own scholarship from the very beginning, in fact. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you this evening about precisely this conjuncture. Social transformation has animated the center for its entire 50 years and produced probably the most important social research center in India, at least for sure, and perhaps in all of Asia. And that question of social transformation is coded in its very name, particularly in the hopeful, positive sense that I want to give that name. All societies are developing societies, and we, Rajiv and I and everyone else in this room, I believe, are in the business of developing societies. And what I want to offer to you this evening are some thoughts about philology, which over the course of the last 75 or 100 years has plummeted from the summit of the university, from the summit of what I've sometimes called the great chain of academic being, to the very bottom of that, of the university in that great chain. A trajectory that the Philology people are keen to change. And I want to suggest how philology can make its own contribution, small, from our small little world of scholarship towards this developmental function. It's been very difficult to embody the conjuncture I've just been speaking about between philology and social theory and social transformation in academic practice. An early chapter in the ongoing quest was the critique of Orientalism. That was actually the outcome of a historically determined disorientation about the place of the Orient in the conceptual order of the Occident. The attempt to recalibrate this location began with the critique of colonialism. And indeed, postcolonialism was the dominant form of scholarship for people like me throughout virtually our entire careers, even when we were not entirely aware that that was the case. It finally became obvious about 10 years ago that the disruptions of colonialism are more difficult to understand if you do not know what was there before colonialism to be disrupted. And so over the course of the last 10 years, there has been a reorientation of this scholarship. The epistemological claim that was trumpeted about in the early days of Orientalist critique that the pre-colonial was unknowable as such, because, as someone once said, colonial discourse is already forever marked colonized society, so it's impossible to recuperate any idea uncontaminated from it. This was an outlandish overdrawing of the problem, and served mainly, in my view, to turn a disciplinary vice, the erosion of our knowledge of historical languages, into a theoretical virtue. But I think the hollowness of this claim has been shown by the really quite remarkable work that's been done on what's now typically called early modern South Asia, and that I think was the theme of this year's winter school. Well, whatever the historical period of study, a consistent, if not always clearly enunciated methodological current has run through South Asia studies over this entire period. And that was the attempt to find ways to rebalance the right to represent. Colonialism produced, in the domain of culture and polity and society, a disqualification, as Sudipta Kaviraj has put it, a disqualification of South Asian ways of life in almost all of its forms. South Asia difference was recoded as deficiency, and scholarship's purpose was to right this painful wrong by the recovery of value through a post-colonial investment in precisely that sphere of difference. The right to represent would be rebalanced, and the logic of its difference understood if the non-West could be grasped from the inside out, as I once put it. Now, as I just said, both the Orientalist disorientation of South Asian culture and society and our attempt to reorient it were historically determined. Let me be very clear about this determination, since it underwrites much of what I want to share with you this evening. If we had not been aware earlier, we are certainly aware now, whether from the critique of ideology, the insights of what's sometimes called philosophical hermeneutics, or the implications of neo-pragmatism. We are aware that we write the kind of past that we write, in part because of the kind of present we inhabit and the kind of future we desire. To deny this, I think, is either foolishness or dissembling. We cannot eliminate from the act of understanding the past the interpreting subject and his or her situatedness in the present. And making the present a part of our interpretation is no mere additive to understanding a text or an event. It constitutes the very essence of successful understanding. Now, what I want to ask tonight, and this really is a set of questions that I want to share with you. What I want to ask tonight is whether the present that we are now living through and the future we hope to achieve, whether a far more self-aware kind of scholarship in general and philology in particular is required than is typically practiced in modern universities. One where, for example, postcolonialism, which seems to me to be nearing exhaustion, needs to be supplemented or perhaps supplanted by something different. So what is the present that we are living in at the moment? It's marked, I think, by a series of transformative events in economy, polity, and the physical environment, which in the aggregate are unlike anything the world has seen before. The astonishing economic events beginning in 2008 showed how short-lived was the triumph of capitalism that was exuberantly proclaimed in 1989, and how quickly the talk of the end of history came to an end. What distinguished 2008 from earlier crises is a complicated question that I'm not particularly well qualified to address, but it seems to me that that event occurred in a world that for the first time in history was wholly, if unevenly, capitalist and wholly, if unevenly, interconnected. Never before had the world been so demonstrably susceptible to disruption as a whole by disruption in any one part. And never before have we so totally lacked actually existing alternatives to the world capitalist order. The political events unfolding in the Middle East at the end of 2010 were as astonishing as the economic events and just as unprecedented historically. They've suggested to some, maybe a bit prematurely, that the post-colonial order is coming to an end. That order was based in part on a set of binary categories. Some of this comes from my colleague Hamid Dabashi. A set of binary categories, religious, secular, traditional, modern, that current events suggest may be about to be blasted out of history. A new and spontaneous super-regional political dynamism, perhaps even a long repressed cosmopolitanism may be re-emerging or emerging. The colony and its history and all the vintage post-colonial ideologies, as Hamid calls them, anti-colonial nationalism, militant Islamism, third world socialism, seem a bit less relevant today to all of these developments. But what is absolutely certain, and I think we would all agree to this, is that the genie of social justice, freedom, and dignity will never be put back in the bottle again. Last, in addition to these economic and political events, are the events in the physical world, which have made it clear beyond doubt that climate change is real and substantially man-made. The tipping point we're reaching in climate change, while radically transforming the world itself, is also radically transforming the understanding of the place of human beings in the world. We have entered, as you all know, a new age called the Anthropocene, the age of human climate change, human-driven climate change. There are some dreadful realizations here for how life will be lived in the future and experienced in the coming decades. Bruno Latour wrote a wonderful piece recently about the end of the sublime. That is to say, the idea that nature is eternal and human beings are small, insignificant entities in the face of nature. We now know that human beings are stronger than nature in some sense. The sublime has vanished. But there are some empowering realizations too. For example, that a new kind of species consciousness may be possible. Some of you will know this superb piece that Dipesh Chakrabarti wrote on the climate of history. And as Dipesh puts it, any thought of the way out of our current predicament cannot but refer to the idea of deploying reason in global collective life. So just as the economic events of the past 5 years have demonstrated the instability of the world capitalist system, the political events in the Middle East and elsewhere, the instability of the world's political order, so the now indubitable evidence of climate change has finally convinced us of the absolute limits to limitless growth and the constant revolutionizing of production. Some of you will remember the source of those quotes. And the expansionism that lies at the heart of capitalism. To the pessimist of spirit, this probably suggests that the world is going to hell. To the optimist of the will, it suggests that the task of remaking the conceptual agenda of our practices, and for someone like me, a specific intellectual in a particular place, the practices of philology, makes some sense. Now, I call remaking this conceptual agenda liberation philology, But I could have called it post-capitalist philology. I could have called it the unfinished project of pre-modernity, perhaps. Post-capitalism is certainly a central concern of what liberation means to me. It does not appear in my title, however, for a number of reasons. Partly, I think we've had enough postology, as someone once put it. Partly, I'm hesitant to grant primacy to the economic or to suggest a monocausal explanation for the present predicament. Capitalism as such was not exclusively responsible for the creation of the Anthropocene, that's for sure. Or to apply a Marxist analysis that often recapitulated the very monological critique attributed to capital itself, producing a single sociology for the entire world that elided precisely the diversity of imaginations that philology exists to capture. As for Latour's non-modernism, it is even vaguer and less actionable than post-capitalism. You can occupy Wall Street capitalism, but I don't see how you occupy modernity. It's not so easy, let alone to turn Latour's disaggregation and purification into political weapons. Now, while it may remain unclear to you even at the end of my talk how liberation philology is supposed to liberate us, and liberate us from what, it should be clear that no core practice of human being, and philology is no less core than philosophy, can escape rethinking in the face of our truly perilous future. So what does this signify for the small little world in which most of us in this room exist, the world of philologists, of historians, other kinds of scholars who believe that scholarship and scholarly inquiry are essential for human life? What would it mean concretely in terms of theory and methods and objects of study to begin to think about our scholarship as self-awarely aiming towards some different future, towards getting beyond our current situation, in addition to or even instead of postcolonialism that we've lived with for 30 years? What would it mean to aim towards securing future rights rather than correcting past wrongs, toward what Rorty called the obligation to construct a planet-wide inclusivist community? How do you do that at the level of philology? That's really my question. I think it's obvious we can't begin to create a liberation or post-capitalist theory or method without having a better grasp of what capitalist theory and method comprise. Or another way to put this, the conceptual consequences of capitalism for scholarship, for scholarly practice. I can hear you say, come on, that's precisely what much of the humanities and social sciences have been thinking about in the last 100 years. What is Weber's theory of rationality about? Or Latour's whole discussion of purifications of modernity, or the thin simplifications that James Scott saw in the rise of the nation state in the 19th century. In fact, what about Rorty's philosophy in the mirror of nature with respect to the question of truth itself? Or Charles Taylor's secularism with respect to the sphere of religion? Or Depeche's provincializing Europe with respect to certain kinds of historicist thinking? And that list doesn't even begin to take on the sharp critiques of capitalism and the consequences, the conceptual consequences of capitalism we find in great thinkers like Gandhi, Ambedkar, Lohia, and so on. Tonight, however, I am not concerned with these grand conceptual transformations of capitalism or modernity or enlightenment. I am concerned with the intellectual presuppositions of scholarly theory and method that we accept as completely normative in scholarship, although they are, I want to suggest, or at least put on the table, are new convictions of the era of capital. It's odd, I've been looking around for something, but I don't find a single scholarly work that attempts to understand these presuppositions as a coherent assemblage. There's a large literature on the marketization of the university, contemporary university, other aspects of academic capitalism, including, of course, the gradual elimination of those financial sinkholes known as philology departments. But what about this more intimate area, this more intimate domain of scholarly presuppositions that a liberation form of reading should address? Can we identify intellectual practices we need to overcome if we are to contribute in our scholarly way to overcoming the present, to help create that inclusivist species-wide community? This is what I want to turn to now. Let me just get some water. It's harder than, I hope I'm not confusing you too much. I mean, I've been thinking about this for quite some time, and I'm not sure I've got it right, but I want to discuss three aspects of the conceptual consequences of capitalism at the level of scholarly practice and how that affects philology. That's my argument now. I'll speak about the two first very quickly, and then spend more time on the third. The first will be obvious. One presupposition that shapes contemporary scholarship very profoundly, although in so many ways now in contested ways, the universal claims of theory. The second is comparativism as a form of axiology. What I mean by that is comparativism. It doesn't just compare things, it ranks them along a chain of excellence. We're very familiar with the whole universal claims of Western theory, but to hear these, I'm just going to recite a few, just to hear them boldly proclaimed is a bit unsettling. Here are a few. In no instance does domination voluntarily limit itself to the appeal to material or affectional or ideal motives. In every system, domination always attempts to cultivate the belief in its legitimacy. That's Weber. The Oedipus complex is a situation which every child everywhere is destined to pass through and which follows inevitably, blah, blah. That's Freud. The epic world is constructed in a zone of absolute distance image beyond possible contact with a re-evaluating present. That's Bakhtin. He's never been to India. Social actors behave as if congruities of blood, speech, custom have an overpowering coerciveness in and of themselves. For virtually every person, how could he say this? For virtually every person in every society at almost all times, such attachments are present. That's Clifford Geertz. I bet he wish he had that back. But how about this one? The history of all hitherto existing societies. That's the only one that may be true. Well, I wrote a book called The Language of the Gods and the World of Men, and I talk about some of this, universalist claim business, localisms masquerading as universalisms in detail, and I won't address it any further here. But its capacity for foreshortening rather than expanding pluralism should be obvious. And I think it raises serious problems about the nature of theory as such. Comparativism is a little bit more complicated, since, curiously enough, there exists no comparative history of comparativism. It's very odd that should be the case. But unless somebody can enlighten me, I just haven't found one. And by comparativism, I mean a method of knowing the world that may originate in and certainly seems foundational to capitalist thought. And here I would recommend to you a careful reading of Hegel's Aesthetics, where I believe you can see the full emergence of comparativism as a method which finds essences and ranks them in a sort of ontological hierarchy. But I don't have time to talk about comparison for now because that's a little off topic. And I've written about that in a paper called Comparison Without Hegemony, which I'd be happy to send you if you drop me a note. But what I want to do in the remainder of this talk is concentrate on a third basic presupposition that shapes philology directly. It shapes, I think, the way we read. Now again, as I never hesitate to state, philology is the core of the humanities, since philology at its core is concerned with making sense of language in general and text in particular. And by the way, for my present purposes, it doesn't matter what kind of text we're talking about. Rajiv was absolutely right. These can be written or oral, they can be fiction and nonfiction, old and new. As Nietzsche said, and it's the only time I'll quote Nietzsche, philology deals with books, with newspaper reports, with the most fateful events, and with weather statistics. It's the whole domain of textuality. And the core of making sense of text, is after learning the languages. Jean Pollock, the great French philologist who died 3 or 4 days ago, the first thing is maîtriser la matière. First, you have to master the material. Outside of that, the next big question is the problem of interpretation. And at the core of liberation philology, at least as I see it on this night in Delhi, is overcoming the constraints that have shaped interpretation for the past 400 years. Now, the older one gets, the more autobiographical one gets. I don't know what it is about getting older, but I want to make my point not really about this problem of interpretation, not so much by a heavy theoretical argument, but by kind of an autobiography of reading or a memoir of reading, the story of how I've come to reconcile, or I believe I've reconciled, what I always found to be seriously conflicting modes of making sense of text. I was trained as a classical philologist in a German philological tradition. I was trained in the US, but by people who had studied in the Wilhelmovitz, if that name means anything anymore, that German philological historicist tradition. But I was also trained as a Sanskritist who participates in another great tradition of philology that has its own claims to knowledge. And at the same time, over the course of my life, I've come to have my understanding of philology tempered by a critical hermeneutics of understanding and a pragmatist vision of truth, and the very forceful invitation it extends to us to rethink what truth is, in fact. Now, the elements of my little autobiography of reading has each of them a little history. Each of these 3 philological selves corresponds with a conceptual moment in the history of our present. The historicism that I was trained in as a classicist, Greek and Latin, that has formed the basis of modern philology for 4 centuries, the rise of postcolonial understanding in the past 30 years, and what I will refer to as traditionism. So the historicism of one part of my life, the traditionism, which has a certain post-colonial edge, which comes from my Sanskrit work, and the presentism, and here I'm extending this notion a little bit over what Rajiv spoke about earlier, and the presentism that I claimed at the beginning of this talk is an inescapable dimension of understanding the world. These 3 things, historicism, traditionism and presentism have been at war in myself for 40 years. And I guess in part because they've been at war with each other for 400 years. Now, these three selves of mine orient themselves along three different, let's call them planes of a text's existence: the moment of its genesis, the tradition of its reception, and the text's presence in my own subjectivity here and now. The first and biggest argument I want to make, no, it's not the biggest, it's the second of two big arguments, but it's the first. The first argument I want to make is that it's only in the sum total of these very meanings generated on all three planes together that correct interpretation, the text's true reading, can lie. And it is toward that triad of meanings that liberation philology simultaneously directs, and in full self-awareness directs itself. Now, there will be questions about the coherence of this triad, and we can talk about that. It's bedeviled people, and here Rorty's neo-pragmatism is of some help. We may not always be able to make these various desires cohere with one another, but they may not be the worse off for that. I think I agree with Rorty that Plato got it wrong. We don't have to get everything to get together. My second argument, and this is the important one, is that what I'll call this three-dimensional philology helps us cultivate simultaneously three broad commitments that are of a special significance for the project of liberation. One, a commitment to scientific truth that took a beating over the last 15 or 20 years. Commitment to global solidarity, and a commitment to critical self-awareness of our presence in the world and the purposes of our philological work. So let me go into these three dimensions of philology in a little bit more detail. Ajit said I should speak for 55 minutes, which I think is about 10 minutes to 8 or so. I'll try to meet his needs. The three planes or axes along which we plot reading, the time, place of a text genesis, that of earlier readers, and that of me reading here and now, suggests that there are potentially three different dimensions of meaning: the author's meaning, the tradition's meaning, and my own meaning. And thus, three potentially different true meanings of the text. The problem I've always had is that I always believed that these truths were mutually exclusive. In fact, that the latter two, the truth of tradition and the truth that my reading of the text, whatever truth that held, were not truths at all. Something that I conceive recapitulates a very long history. How did we learn to read this way, is the question. I suggest in part it's the history of capitalist modernity. If this doesn't actually begin where I suggest it begins, in 1670 in Amsterdam with Spinoza, then at least Spinoza is there as a sort of paradigm of what I'm talking about. Let me be quick about this one section. It's important, but a bit complicated. And it has to do with the text that Spinoza wrote in 1670, called the Theological Political Tractate, which it's been very central in a lot of contemporary thinking. It's viewed as the charter document of Western modernity, Spinoza as the renegade Jew who gave us modernity, and so on and so forth. The work could have been called the Philological Political Tractate. That would have been a much better answer, because the argument at the heart of this work is the conviction that good philology makes for good polity. The work has 20 chapters, 15 are devoted to philology, and 5 are devoted to living the life in Republican Holland. In Spinoza's case, the idea was that learning a philological method for reading the Bible can transform relations of knowledge and power in the Commonwealth and produce a just democracy. It's in fact the very method and the very idea that there is a method to philology that is found in the Tractatus. And in fact, the list of the philological components would be familiar to everyone in the Zukunftsphilologie project. They're all available for the first time as an aggregate, as a whole, in the tractate. You know them all, from deep familiarity with the text, with the original language of the text, as deep a familiarity as you can develop, learning the history of the transmission of the text, the current text critical state, its history of canonization, the problem of discourse analysis, the historical context of the text, the relevant biography of the author, constraints of the authorial intention, the nature of the original audience. It's really quite remarkable what Spinoza believes to be the armamentarium, the toolbox of philology. It's precisely what we teach our students. Spinoza's basic method is historical in spirit. All anachronism must be avoided, but it's also historicist. There's a mode of thinking and being specific to a text's own time. Furthermore, meaning is entirely objective. There is a true meaning of the text, and that true meaning is singular. The text can have only one true meaning. Above all, there is a science of text, and that's to be assimilated to the natural sciences. There is one true meaning, and science certifies. In a sense, we know in advance what the text means because tradition has told us what it means. And in a sense, a Marxist reading of history is basically a finalist or even patristic reading. For Spinoza's interpretation, the standard is reason, not extrinsic authority. It is, as he says, the only true method which discovers the only true sense. Now, what's important to note here are two things. One, while investigating the sense of Scripture, it was important for Spinoza that readers not be preoccupied with their own views. Secondly, Spinoza was concerned that no human gloss or speculation, that is to say, no commentary on it, no traditional understanding of the text can tell us what Scripture means, only close criticism. So here in the tractate, in a single blow, we have what I would argue is the capitalist revolution at the level of philology, where the whole train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, you'll remember that quote too, were swept away at a stroke. Now, whether or not my historical reconstruction is true or even coherent, they claim that the tractate is the charter text of modernity. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. It is unquestionably the case that the values that animate Spinoza, I've already put my poor friend to sleep. I have to shout louder. The values that animate Spinoza have become values for everyone. Whatever the history of each separate item in his arsenal, no one before him had ever assembled them into an operational method. And from its struggle with the earlier patristic opponent, philology emerged as the victor. Now, it's true that this was in 1670, a very progressive text. Spinoza was writing against a clique of powerful theologians. And at that moment, the text had a powerful political charge to to deliver. But the question for me now in 2012 is whether this attempt to reduce the plurality of interpretation, even and especially interpretation with which you disagree, to erase the reader's own historicity in favor of a singular meaning that is entirely historicist and determined in accordance with the procedures of natural science, still makes sense for an inclusivist planetary community. Do texts mean what they mean once and for all, singularly and unchangingly? Is Spinoza's good reading, is our philology's good reading, good everywhere and always? Let me see if I can make my objections to Spinoza clear if we look at the materials that Spinoza proscribed. And I want to start with a traditionist. In the case of my field, field of Indology, the dismissal of the reading of tradition typified by Spinoza became absolute common sense in the late 19th and early 20th century. We can actually follow the lineage from Spinoza all the way to W.D. Whitney, the first great American Sanskritist. And it was not surprising to have Whitney write around 1880. There are, in fact, when he was discussing a medieval commentary on the Vedas, he said, there are, in fact, in my opinion, few figures more absurd than that of Sayana, that's the name of the commentary, posing as one who comprehends and can teach others to comprehend a difficult Vedic passage. Sayana could not understand the Veda, said W.D. Whitney. We're no longer surprised that this view of tradition was coupled with a strong assertion of the exclusivity of truth. Whitney said, there is one true Veda with its true meaning, which must have been one and not many, said Whitney. And there's obviously complete suppression of the third plane of meaning, the meaning of what the Veda means to me now. Whitney was the kind of guy that would have driven Nietzsche insane, I'm sure, if he had known about it. Now, recovering the value of tradition after centuries of this sort of repudiation is not a simple thing. Now, I'm not the first person who's thought about this. Some of you in the audience will know the names of Hans Robert Jauss, or the man I just mentioned recently, Jean Pollock, the great classical scholar who set up the School of Lille. But the curious thing about both Jauss and Pollock is that for them, the history of the past, of the reception history, was a history of basically of error. You sifted the past to see if there was any truth there in order to establish the same singular meaning of the text. And in fact, I would love to discuss this with the philologists in the room on another occasion. You can see this working out in the struggles between Bédier and Lachmann. On the one hand, sort of pluralist interpretation of text criticism, on the other, a very narrow view that has its contemporary genealogy in Sebastiano Timpanaro or Didi Kosambi. More about that if anybody cares to hear the question and answer. Now, here's the point I want to make. For me, traditionism is not a history of error. It's not the way to achieve the one true interpretation of the text, like Pollock or Jauss. In my view, and I want to make this very precise, there can be no such thing as an incorrect interpretation. All interpretations are embodiments of human consciousness called into being by certain properties in the text, and such forms of consciousness cannot be correct or incorrect in their historical existence. What we philologists in part aim to capture when we read along the plane of tradition are those forms themselves, and together with those forms, not only what may it be, what there may be about their world that shaped their view of the text, but also what there may be about the text that called those interpretations into being. Traditionist reading is not a means toward the one true interpretation of the text. Traditionism provides truth of its own, a history of the human species struggling with meaning. This philological pluralism and I'll come back to define that term, has actually almost been institutionalized in the Sanskrit tradition. Texts, as some of you in the room will know, were produced precisely to demonstrate that there cannot be one true interpretation of the text. The proliferation of meaning, rather than the reduction of meaning, is a basic practice of the Indian exegetical tradition. If you ever looked at something like the Naishadhiya Charita, the very first verse, Napiya yasya kshitirakshina kataha, the very first verse draws 12 meanings from one particular commentary, and he proliferates meaning as in full self-awareness of its validity. Interpretive strategy, his more Western monological theory, does not always and everywhere seek to impose restrictions. Interpretive strategy does not always proceed by subtraction. In fact, in India, the purpose of many texts is to create a model reader defined as one who can generate the most interpretations of the text, indeed, infinite interpretations. I think this possibility of philological pluralism needs to be recovered. I think it was there, self-aware in the past, and I want to tell you two little stories before I go on to my question of presentism. These two stories, one was told to me by my dear friend Musaffar from the Islamic tradition, and one is from the Hebrew tradition, which was told me by my grandfather. Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi, is reported to have said once that he was one with all the 73 sects of Islam. That's to say, with their different textual interpretations. When he was abused by the follower of a particular school for this statement, Rumi smiled and replied, "I'm also in agreement with whatever you say." And here's my grandfather's story. A rabbi was once asked to decide between two disputants, say, call them two texts. To the first he said, "You're right." And to the second he said, "You're right." And then somebody came up to her, an objector arose and said, "Both cannot be right at the same time." And the rabbi replied, "You're right too." Philological pluralism is a value we need to recover somehow. The doctrine that there is a potential infinity of equally valuable ways to make sense of a text. It's sort of quoting Rorty's philosophical pluralism. Let me turn briefly now, I don't have too much more time, another 10 minutes, to my third plane of philology, which is something I call presentism. The presence of our present in the construction of our knowledge. Who can deny that any longer? After Freud, after Marx, after Gadamer. The most significant part, in fact, Rajiv referred to him, of Gadamer's hermeneutics, are first his critique of historicism, and second his notion of application. I just want to say, I've written about both. I'll say something very brief about them. There's a very poignant passage in a book by a guy named Grodin, where he speaks of the ghost of metaphysics that haunts historicism. Our belief and Spinoza's belief that historicist knowledge, which consists in the impossible, even contradictory conviction that meaning is specific to its historical moment, presupposes paradoxically that the historian's own historical being can be erased in grasping that earlier historical meaning, that we can somehow escape our own moment in capturing the historical moments of other people. It's very unironic as a result that Spinoza's own reading of the Bible shows precisely this presentism. The true meaning of the Bible turns out to be the meaning that Spinoza's philosophy demanded of the Bible. Spinoza's interpretation is as finalist as that of his adversaries. Whatever text it analyzed, it illustrates Spinoza's thought. In addition to the antinomies of historicism, Gadamer also dissects understanding and finds in it an essential component he calls application. I think Rajiv referred to this. The capacity to inscribe the affect of the text upon the affect of the listener. The preacher in the West, or the pravachanakara who does a Bhagavata pravachana or Manas pravachana, is the most evident bearer of this skill in translating the meaning of those texts into the souls of the congregation. This is exemplary. The meaning of every text must always be applied to us and embody a significance for us. The application to the interpreter is not a supplement to understanding. It constitutes its very essence. Far from being a hermeneutical crime, presentism is a hermeneutical necessity. And I wish I had time to describe my own little journey to this truth, since I grew up as a Marxist who believed that all we cared about was the historical origins of that text, and its meaning to us in the present was absolutely irrelevant. Now, how far the modernist idea that the meaning of a text can only be singular has penetrated and perverted the open hermeneutic of pre-modern India is spectacularly visible in the reduction of the plurality of, say, the Ramayana tradition in the past several decades, indeed the past few years. While the Ramayana was once a veritable language for the expression of difference, regional difference, gender difference, religious differences in religious belief, in kinship relations, which lasted over 2 millennia. Today, there can only be one real Ramayana. Valmiki's Ramayana, maybe, or Tulsi's Ramayana, or Ramanand Saga's Ramayana, but there's only one real Ramayana. The idea that there could be 300 Ramayanas drives some people insane. And could easily be regarded as a perversion of authentic tradition. Such are the ironies of modernity. Now I'll take another 10 minutes. I want to give you an example. I'll just stay with the Ramayana for a second, and then I'll wrap up with my ethical stuff. What would the 3 dimensions of philology look like if you were teaching the Ramayana to kids in a class? Taking that as exemplary of living a philological life, if you can make that leap. What might it look like? Well, you would approach it first, as I did, as a historicist, and you would say, there's something about this text that suggests very strongly that it was written in the world of post-Ashokan ideology, that it envisages a polity that was made possible by an Ashokan spiritualization, and that attempts to answer the nightmarish problem that the Mahabharata left us with: how can polity exist without fratricidal violence? That would be the way I would do a historical interpretation of the historicist interpretation of the Valmiki Ramayana. But then, you read the Ramayana, and unfortunately you're confronted with 500 or 600 years of interpreters of the Ramayana. What do you do with them? You just throw them in the ash can? Or how do you find a way to grant truth to these commentators? So, from the 11th century onward, 12th century, we have half a dozen Sri Vaishnava commentators who view the Ramayana as the record of the existence of God on earth. I mean, they're the kind of patristic readers that I was talking about earlier. And those kinds of readers made the Ramayana, particularly in its vernacular versions, among the most important texts in the history of India. What do we do with that those sorts of interpretations? In my traditionism account, I grant them full truth. None of those interpretations is false. Reading in the present, from a presentist point of view. What do we do when this text comes alive in 1992 on the cover of India Today or in the streets of Ayodhya? One is prompted to reflect on the presence of the past in India, the text's infinite malleability, and not least, I would say, the obligations of the present-day reader to register the nature of this repurposing over time in the current moment. Now, all of these three meanings of the Ramayana, the historicist, the traditionist, the presentist, that is the contemporary political, including my own reading of the presence of the text in the presence, these are all true, none more or less true than the others. Now, I'm going to wrap up now in the next 5 minutes to keep my plot troth with Rajiv. Learning to do philology in these three dimensions simultaneously, keeping all the balls in play at once, is a challenge. It's a challenge. No practicing philologist who sits down to read a text doubts, and this is where I part ways with Mr. Rorty, doubts that there is a deeper and even truer textual truth that we can get to as historicists. And we cannot but continue to strive along that scientific path. But at the same time, we need to understand that there are truths in historical consciousness that are concretized in the false, or what may appear to be false, interpretations of the past, no less than in the true, or what may appear to be true interpretations. Falsehood contains truth. Imagination contains truth. Lies contain historical truth. No less essential or unavoidable is the truth of our own here and now reading, which is inevitably going to be vastly different from planes 1 and 2, since it's mediated by our own historicity, our own historical experience. The sum total of these, and you've heard this already, I'm just going to say it one more time, the sum total of these readings in all three dimensions constitutes the full philological truth of the text. What a text means is nothing but what the text has been taken to mean by the people who have read it or heard it. Its one true meaning is the assemblage of all these meanings, which we use in different ways depending on the different kinds of sense we are aiming to make of the world. We do not need to rank or reconcile these truths. Liberation philology simultaneously respects the science, the scientific value of the truth, the pragmatic value of pluralism, and the hermeneutical necessity of asking, what possibility does the text give me to understand my own being? I take 2 more minutes to talk about the ethics of all of this. What I think is, what I would want to suggest is the most important part of this whole rant, if you will, is the political ethical objectives that I would like to suggest emerge out of this tripartite, triadic reading. Let me restate that the enduring methodological value of that work of Spinoza's I was talking about is that reading is an enactment of political and ethical values. You are how you read. Learning to read differently means learning to be differently. There is nothing contrived about three-dimensional reading. This is actually the way the human mind works. When we start facing up to these two aspects, we are doing liberation philology, and we are liberating philology. Now, the ethical objectives of a new reading I'm going to try to state for you as clearly as possible, first negatively and then positively. If you read as a historicist, you help to discipline the arrogance of the pure presentist, the consumer, who only wants what pleases him or her, and whose lives are taken, whose own lives are taken to be the standard of all previous lives. The text can mean only what it means to me. Historicism helps us defeat that type of position. Traditionism helps us to counter the insularity of monologists like Mr. Whitney, who believe that all meaning must be singular and that they alone, in their office in New Haven, Connecticut, they are in possession of that meaning. Reading on plane 3, the presentist reading, helps us to dispel the illusion of the historicists, who believe historicism applies to everyone except for themselves. And he refused to believe, in fact, who refuse to believe that they can, indeed, that they must measure the text by their own experience. Now, the positive side of this whole exercise. Reading as a historicist helps us better comprehend the nature of human existence and the radical differences it has shown over time, the vast variety of ways that history has shown for human beings to be differently. Without that historical, indeed historicist approach, you cannot capture the oddness of the past. Traditionism teaches us patience and charity for understanding the views of others, no matter how strange they may be. And so to expand the possibilities of human solidarity. And presentism helps us to make better sense. Indeed, it forces us to make sense of our own place in the world. All three dimensions must be acknowledged simultaneously. There will always be cases where, depending on the use we make of the text, one is going to be emphasized over the other. For in the end, liberation philology is less about the truth of text than about the uses of text, less about cracking codes than about purposes to be served. It may well be that there are other practices, human practices, that can teach us these lessons, both negative and positive, but I know of none that can do so as consistently and immediately as reading disciplined by liberation philology. And nothing might be so necessary for a post-capitalist epistemology and the planet-wide inclusivist community whose creation it is the purposes of such scholarship to serve. Thank you very much.